and welcome. My name is Phoebe Patterson. I'm a member of the Missoula Consolidated Planning Board, and I'd like to welcome you to Missoula's first Growth Management Issues Forum. I would like to just very briefly give you a brief welcome and move on to the evening's event. But I would like to mention that tonight was the idea of our board chairperson, Ginny Cass. We have an education fund for the planning board to stay on top of issues that are current to planning. And that education fund had some money left in it, and Ginny Cass thought it was an idea to bring a speaker that could educate all of us as well in the community, not just the planning board. And we did a little homework, and we're very fortunate to find out that Frank Gray was not only one of the best, he was also available to us. The bad news is Ginny Cass was not available to us. So I'm sorry that she couldn't be here this evening, but we are taping it, and she will be able to see it later. We are hoping this is the beginning and that some other organizations or groups or individuals would be interested in carrying the torch and bringing in future speakers and carrying on the forum idea. Those who helped the planning board make this possible, our co-sponsors, were the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce, the Missoula Neighborhood Network Incorporated, and Phi Alpha Theta History Honor Society. And I especially want to thank those folks. An additional thank you I would like to extend is to the Missoulian. They were quite generous in sponsoring some advertising help for us. And we also received some excellent support from the staff at the Office of Community Development and the Rural Community Development Office. With that, I would like to move on and turn it over to Mayor Dan Kemmis.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, and thanks to the Planning Board for taking the initiative in establishing what I very much hope will be a series of forums. And as we move beyond summertime in Missoula, we'll hope that we'll be able to get more and more people attending them. But I want to thank everybody, too, who has shown up tonight for this first forum on growth management planning in Missoula. In addition to thanking the Planning Board for their leadership, I also want to thank the co-sponsors, the Chamber of Commerce and the Neighborhood Network, and Phi Alpha Theta for their sponsorship of this. And I also want to thank my colleagues in Missoula County for their support for this program. Tonight we're going to hear from Frank Gray, whose credentials in growth management are as good as anybody that I can imagine. Frank has been actively involved as a professional with a number of communities that have been faced with growth pressures that I think are very similar to those that we're facing now in Missoula. He has been a planning director in Denver, Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado, and very active in growth management issues in Petaluma, California. In Denver, in addition, he was very actively involved with the planning, the land use planning, and the economic development planning for the new international airport there. Actually, I threatened to say that what he was chiefly responsible for was the baggage delivery system, but that apparently is not the case. Frank is currently the director of the Department of Community Planning and Development for the city of Lakewood in Colorado. Frank Gray is internationally recognized for his work on growth management, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking to you about his credentials, his publications, and his speeches and awards, because it's really he that you want to hear from and not me. But among other things, he has presented to the World Congress on the International Federation for Housing and Planning a workshop on the rationale and operation of growth management systems, and that was in the Vienna, Austria. He has received awards from the American Institute of Architects, the International City Management Association, and the American Planning Association. And so it is a real pleasure for me to introduce Frank Gray and to congratulate everyone in Missoula who has had the foresight to acknowledge that given the challenges that we face right now in Missoula, that it is very much to our advantage to hear from someone with the expertise and the breadth of experience of Frank Gray. Frank.
Can I make a pact with you? If I move this down there, would you all move in here? This is horrible. I might need a hand here with that. It makes the camera people scramble. Much better. Let me divide tonight into several parts. First part is going to be story time. I'll tell you little stories about Petaluma and what happened with the Petaluma Growth Management Plan. And many of you are curious about that landmark case and sort of how it came about. And in doing that, I think you'll see a lot of similarities to what you're dealing with here. Although I need to say from the outset, it's my belief that I've done or helped maybe 40 communities over the last 25 years deal with growth management issues, and I can tell you categorically there are no two same solutions anywhere. So you just can't take a solution that one community's come up with and try to implant it in another community, because communities are radically different. They might look the same, but interaction-wise, people-wise, physical appearance-wise, they're very different. Second thing is, periodically I'm losing my voice over the last couple of weeks, so I will be sipping something periodically so that we don't go off the air here in the middle. Petaluma was an interesting case, and let me start back in the late 1960s. Petaluma, which is located north of San Francisco. There's San Francisco, and then there's Marin County, and then you move into Sonoma County. And the very first city you get into in Sonoma County going north from San Francisco is Petaluma. And what happened was that if you look at the sort of what I call the ring of tolerance, if you will, the ring of tolerance for commute, went out into Marin County, and immediately Marin County shut down. And the way Marin County shut down is they zoned everything to 35-acre lots. And if any of you know Marin County, it's a very high-end community. It has Tiburon, all the Marin County Center and the area out there. And so what happened was that growth immediately leaped over Marin County and jumped up into Sonoma County, and the very first piece of that ring was Petaluma, of course, since it was right over the border. As that occurred, the city staff became rather concerned that the public infrastructure, the water system, the sewer system, the roads and schools, those kinds of things, were going to rapidly get used up. And so about in the late 1960s, the staff started telling the council, we got a problem here, you need to do something about it. And the problem that we as staff identified was a physical infrastructure problem. The council, of course, being a politically motivated body, didn't see any of their constituents saying it's time to do something about it. And as a matter of fact, as long as the constituents turned on their water tap and water came out, and as long as they flushed their toilet and it didn't talk They didn't have a problem. And so what's the problem? This then, to give you some relative feel, the San Francisco Bay Area as a whole was growing at about a growth rate. Petaluma was growing at an 18% annual growth rate. In addition to that, there was some real disparities occurring. The highway goes right through, or right around the edge of, as it was originally planned, Petaluma. What happened is all the new growth was occurring to the east of the highway, and all the old growth was to the west of the highway. The highway planners, in their great wisdom, had only planned 2 interchanges to the freeway, and so there were only 2 ways to get across. And in fact, what we were doing was creating 2 communities, them and us, the old timers and those new yokels. Now, it was, I'm sorry, in my introduction that was read, the 2 things that kept being stressed was California and Colorado, and I understand they're in that order, not the place to be from around here, so I'm sorry, but just look at it this way, you can learn from our mistakes. So what was happening was locationally all the new development was occurring. There were people who I interviewed or who I talked to who lived in Petaluma who had never been in downtown. They lived there for 5 years and never been across the freeway because their relationship was to work in San Francisco, home again, and to work in San Francisco and home again. And they didn't know what the old town looked like. And so the them and us culture started to develop, and it became politically as well as socially very unbalanced. Also, if you look at sort of natural housing market trends, developers will build the most profitable development unit. That's reasonable. And the most profitable development unit in that case was the detached single-family home. As long as there was lots of raw land, you just divided it up and you built detached single-family homes. Because there were a lot of people who really wanted to live in San Francisco but couldn't afford it, who were buying houses up in Petaluma and living there. And so you have a type problem, you have a rate problem, and you have a location problem. And those are the 3 key elements to growth management. Growth management deals with rate, type, and location of development and balances those 3 things together. There are tools in the planner's tool chest, if you will, to deal with each one of those things. But there were no tools in the 1970s to deal with all 3 of them and their interrelationship to each other. And so we developed some, let me just go backwards in history a little bit. So things were going along and the staff was warning the city that there was this problem. Again, locationally, you can see if all the new housing is being built over here and the sewer plant's over here, you're going to have some problems. Maybe it's sort of like there's a certain road out here, starts with an R. The sewer stops right there, and it's the same kind of thing that was going on. The sewer system was quite adequate for the old town, inadequate for the new areas. And so the problem still didn't become a problem. Well, what happens in growth, especially with certain services, is that as growth occurs, it's an exponential curve, and it's not a straight line curve. Straight line growth can be dealt with fairly easily, especially if it's the same slope on the line, because you're always working behind a little bit. This is particularly true in schools, where schools get their funding by having children. But by the time children are there, you're 3 years behind the curve for facilities. So on a flat line growth, that's just fine. But when Johnny comes home with a tag attached to him that says, your child is going on triple sessions next year, there were 1,000 people down at the council chambers going on, what is going on? Well, that was And that was what hit the throttle at Petaluma. And, you know, the council chambers were inundated with people, and the council going, where did these people come from? I mean, it's the state that's been thinking we have a problem. Well, all of a sudden there was a political constituency there. And so the city set out to try to deal with that issue. And they created something called the Environmental Design Plan. Now this is a very, very important piece, is what they started out with was a plan to deal with this growth issue from a physical standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, from an economic standpoint, cash flow standpoint. And they took 6 months, they declared a moratorium, no development for the next 6 months. We've got to sit down and figure out what's going on here. They sat down, they developed this plan, which was a comprehensive plan that looked at these interactive elements. Then they looked at the plan and they said, you know, there's really no mechanism available to implement this plan in any kind of comprehensive way. And so we'll create something called the Residential Development Control System. And we adopted this Residential Development Control System. And basically what that system did, or does today even, is that it takes the city and it says, within this city, this fall, we have a locational problem. And so building permits for the next year, only half of the building permits will be issued on one side of the freeway, on the new side of the freeway. And the other side of the freeway gets the other half of the building permits. Okay? So that's one thing. So locationally, here's what's going to happen. So from a rate standpoint, we believe that the maximum rate at which the city, both sociologically and physically, can absorb new people is about 6% annually. So we'll limit that rate of growth to 6%. And from a type of housing standpoint, no more than half the building permits issued will be for detached single-family homes. And the other half will be for attached single-family homes or multi-family dwellings. So, in essence, there was this balancing that goes on. And then you say, well, how do you do that? I mean, it's great if you could know what it was at the end of the year and then go back and allocate it, but that isn't the way life works. And so there was a competition system set up, or a point system. And once a year, it started out, the developer would submit their plans. The city had a growth management task force that would analyze the plans to see the degree to which they had quality development in them, and also the degree to which they had met the criteria set forth in the environmental design plan. Then there was a recommendation made. No one development was to get more than X number of permits. I forget what the number is now. And that was the beginning of the system. It had some real problems, I'll tell you, and I'll tell you some of the lessons we learned in that. But it was a system that got off the ground. And, you know, this was the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. I had long hair, you know, full beard, all that stuff. And so I came into work one morning, and there on my desk was this very official-looking legal document. And it says, the CIA versus Frank Gray in the city of Petaluma. I thought, they got out my protest. I couldn't figure out what it was, why the CIA was coming after me. Well, it was the Construction Industry Association of Sonoma County, which made me feel a little better until I read the lawsuit. Well, they sued the city of Petaluma and me personally. By the way, I went to get a home loan a couple of years ago, and they do a background search on you. The loan officer who I've known for years came up and said, normally we wouldn't make a loan to somebody that's had 582 lawsuits filed against them personally. But in this case, so being planning directors and economic development directors of cities is not necessarily a pleasant task from time to time. Anyhow, so this was filed, and let me tell you what the basis of that suit was. Because who knows, someday you might get one too. First of all, they claim that, and I think if I have to say, looking back, what the mistake was, there's several mistakes that the construction industry, so all you construction industry people start writing notes here, okay? There's a couple mistakes the construction industry made. First of all, they chose the wrong venue. They chose the wrong court to file the action in. They chose the federal court system. And they chose to file on the basis of infringement of constitutional rights. First contention was that by enacting a synthetic residential development control system, the city interfered with interstate commerce. Now you say, how could that be? Let me give you an example. Suppose I am a lumber mill in Missoula, Montana. Okay? I have a quote-unquote natural market for my product in Petaluma, California. And by artificially dinking around with that market, Petaluma, therefore, is interfering with interstate commerce or the transfer of goods across state lines. Contention number one. Contention number two was that it also infringed on the basic right to live and abide, to travel within the United States, a more vague constitutional right, but one that was established with the Okie laws. Remember the Okie laws that California adopted, which basically said to the people during the Dust Bowl days, if you're from Oklahoma, turn around and go back. And then California adopted a rule that said, sort of like, people in Montana would like to do right now, people from California. But it basically said that if you didn't have a job, you couldn't come into the state. That was taken to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, not quite so fast, California. The one thing that we have in the United States is free travel across state lines, and so that's not a permissible act. So they claimed that by doing that, we were interfering with people moving in and out of the state, and therefore the right to travel. And the third thing was civil rights, what are called 1983 actions, in which you ask for treble damages. And that, in fact, the city, through its process, was discriminating against low and moderate income persons and racially discriminating against people by removing the natural housing markets. We went to court and we're pretty satisfied that we were going to get a fair hearing because the judge that the case was assigned to was known as a very fair judge, and that he really listened to facts, contemplated a great deal of time, and gave fairly academic decisions. And so we were preparing our case, and since we had been sued, we assumed that the right of guilt was the proof of the construction industry, not ours to prove that we hadn't done it. In fact, the day before the trial was to begin, the judge declared, or the construction industry filed a brief with the judge asking him to remove himself from the case because he owned a piece of property about 20 miles away from Petaluma, and that any decision in this case could affect the value of his property. The judge, being a very fair judge, removed himself from the case, and it was assigned to another judge who, in his 22 years on the bench, had never ruled in favor of municipality over private enterprise. We knew we were cooked at that point. We went into court. We assumed that the case would take approximately 3 weeks of testimony. We prepared many witnesses to come forward and everything. And it was obvious at the end of the first day that the judge, first of all, wanted to play golf on Friday, and this was on Monday, and wanted the case to be over on Thursday. And it wasn't a matter of if or not the city was guilty, it was a matter of how guilty we were. And the burden of proof needed to fall on the city's shoulder, not on the plaintiff's shoulder. So all of a sudden, the burden of proof got reversed too. It went on, and we saw that immediately that what we were into was an appellate process. And so we started entering box loads of material into the record, because under the federal appellate process, you can't enter anything new in that isn't in the original trial. So we literally entered box loads and box loads and box loads of stuff into the record. And the judge ruled from the bench on Thursday that in fact the city had violated every one of these rules, and that in fact the city was a very bad boy for having done so. And then turned around to Malcolm Missoula, who was the attorney for the construction industry, and said, "Now you've heard my opinion from the bench, would you please write it up for me?" That was mistake number 2, because Malcolm went back to his office and decided to put everything from soup to nuts in the opinion. Figured this is it. Construction industry is going to score big on this one. And if he had written the opinion very narrow, I think it would have been a lot more difficult to appeal. But it was just everything in the world was in there. So the city appealed it then to, now this is a small little town, folks. This is a town of 30,000 people. No, about 30,000 people with a very little budget. And we're talking about United States Supreme Court, Federal District Court of Appeals. These are not cheap processes. Other communities within the United States and within Colorado for help, sort of like the Clinton Defense Fund, you know, type thing. This is the Petaluma Defense Fund. And we have lots of people who contributed $100, $500, $10,000 to the defense fund so that we could carry on the fight. We went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we had a very good 3-judge panel there. And the judges asked very penetrating questions to the Construction Industry Association. For instance, one of the contentions was that by instituting the system, the city was ensuring that no low and moderate income housing would be ever built in the city again. And in fact, part of the environmental design plan and part of the growth management plan was that 10% of the housing units had to be for elderly or low and moderate income persons. And that in fact we had a whole housing plan which back in the 70s was sort of very unique as to how to implement that. So one of the judges who was from Hawaii leaned over and Malcolm was making this impassioned plea as to how, you know, the poor people of the world were being denied access to the city by this thing. The judge leaned over and said, "Could you give me the exact number of units the construction industry has built of low and moderate income housing units before this plan was implemented?" Well, Your Honor, that's not relevant. He says, "I think it is relevant. Can you tell us how many units the construction industry has built?" "Well, Your Honor, I'm sure there are units. We just don't know what, you know." The answer was none. He finally got him to say, "Well, you know, really none." And he said, "Well, maybe if you stop suing these people and let them get on with implementing their plan, some would get built." The next thing was a racial thing, and they had somebody from the NAACP come forward and entered into the testimony that, in fact, this kind of plan implemented on a region-wide basis would assure that blacks within the community would never have housing opportunity, that would become exclusionary, et cetera. And so the same judge asked if he could please bring forward a family that had not been able to buy a house in the community, that had come and tried to and was not able to. And that's the last we ever heard of him. So it was clear that at least 2 of the judges on the 3-judge panel were going the right way. And in fact, they reversed everything in their opinion. And if you have a chance to read the case, it's a very good case to read. Don't necessarily read the law as it's established in the case, but read the dicta, read the footnotes. They're great. They're wonderful. And they'll give you sort of the tenor and flavor of what the judges were thinking. The construction industry realized that they had just lost all their marbles in the marble game, and so they appealed it to the United States Supreme Court. And we're going to try to drag out the process as long as possible so that they could sort of play break the bank game with the city, and hopefully the city would give up. By this time, this was a group of angry farmers, and any of you understand that phrase, you'll understand that we weren't giving up no matter what it fairly quickly denied right of certiorari. In some words, they said, there's nothing new in this appellate court decision that would warrant our time to rule on. In essence, concurring with the appellate court decision. So that then stood and became one of the landmark cases in growth management. And really established communities' rights, that the right of growth management really didn't infringe upon basic constitutional rights that people have in order to live in a free society. I think that needs to be taken with some very cautious optimism. I think that in creating any kind of growth management system, one needs to keep very, very close tabs on the individual rights versus the community good. And I think that's a balance that you have to build into whatever system that you're dealing with. Well, let's go back to the system for a minute. That's sort of the end of the line on the Petaluma case. And then I'll move on to Boulder here in a second. In Petaluma, the first year we realized that, first of all, nobody builds all at once. And so this idea of having a once-a-year competition really put some tremendous burdens on the development industry. And one of the problems that we had was that we realized a whole series of problems with the growth management system from the very first day we started to implement it. But because the lawsuit had been filed, we didn't dare change anything. We had this whole list of recommended changes on that, but we knew that that would just be used as cannon fodder on us if, in fact, we did anything. And so we were in this horrible position of knowing that the system wasn't at all working the way we wanted it to, but on the other hand, knowing that if we dare changed it, it would get thrown right back in our face. Fortunately, that whole process only took about 2.5 years. And we were able to immediately then make some changes to the system. The first change was to make that a quarterly allotment, and no more than a quarter of the units would be allotted at each time. The second thing was to be able to do reservations in future years. One of the problems was, let's say the maximum number of units any one developer could get was 10 units. It's very difficult to go to the bank and get a loan for infrastructure for a 100-unit subdivision when the only thing you have is the right to build 10 units. And so from a financing standpoint, it became very, very difficult for developers to operate. And so we said, okay, well then let's do reservations in future years, but no more than 3-year reservations. So if a unit got, or the development got a certain number of points, and it had to be a very high point level, then they could get future year reservations. And on and on and on. And the system has changed every year since then. And there is a whole feedback loop, and this is very important for you all to look at when you look at a growth management system, is there is a feedback loop in there so that every year it's examined by a committee of home building industry as well as industrial builders and developers as well as general citizens of the community that sit down and look at the system and say what's working, what's not working, how can we make it better, how can we make it more equitable. And that goes on every year and has since about the third year of the system. And the system that's in effect today looks nothing like the system that was adopted back in the early 70s. The other thing that we did was, you all probably have a comprehensive plan. And it probably looks 20 years out in the future, right? Now, how many of you are where you thought you'd be 20 years ago? I mean, planners are good, but they ain't that good. Okay? I mean, that's sort of, that is sort of Pollyanna type stuff. That's really saying, gosh, if everything were perfect and the sun came up at a certain angle every day, this is how it would be. Isn't that wonderful? Well, it is wonderful to have sort of that long-term vision for the community, but it's not realistic to try to implement that on a day-to-day basis. And so what we did with the environmental design plans is we said, okay, if this is the 20-year planning period for the plan, then what we need are a 5-year window that slides along this line. And every year that 5-year window moves 1 year in the future. So that 5 years, yeah, it's still a cloudy crystal ball, but at least you can get some indication of where you're going. And then when you have, remember the allocation system is in a 3-year window, so you start to get smaller grain yet. You start to get some reality in the planning process and where it's going, and it really reflects the market and the market demands. I mean, housing types that were looked at 20 years ago are not the housing types of today. And yet the housing types of today weren't thought of 20 years ago or weren't part of the community life. And if you had locked yourself into that plan, you wouldn't be living in 1994, 1995. So that's a very, very important piece, is to have that feedback loop and to have some kind of shorter time frame than a comprehensive plan normally affords you. And so we have this environmental design plan. And then every 5 years, so this thing was moving 1 year at a time down here, every 5 years, the 20-year window would ratchet 5 years more out. So there was always this 20-year window, but it was a dynamic process. Planning is not product-oriented. A product is only a snapshot. Think of the product, the planned product, as a Polaroid of that particular moment in time. And then what you need to do is keep, just think if you had taken one picture of your child at the age of 1, and the kid's 23 years old, and you're walking around showing them this picture of kid at 1 who has no relationship to the child. And so what you need to do is be taking this Polaroid picture periodically of the community. And the planning is really an ongoing process and that you're never through. I mean, I know so many planners that go, oh, we finished the comprehensive plan, I don't know what my purpose in life is anymore. That's a commencement. That's a beginning. Somebody has to implement this thing. And that's very, very important. And let me tell you the next story now. The next story is Boulder. And Boulder, Colorado is going through some issues with growth also. And I've been out to Aspen and talked to them about the growth issues they were having there. And several other communities. And in Boulder, there was a person in Boulder by the name of Paul Danish. When you hear about the Danish plan, any of you that study growth management, it has nothing to do with breakfast. It has something to do with the person whose name is Paul Danish. It doesn't have anything to do with Denmark either. Okay. So Paul Danish came out to visit me in Petaluma and spent about 3 days out there, and we went through sort of this whole thing. And Paul got real excited about this implementation tool called the Residential Development Control System. And the Boulder City Council, and this is sort of the City Council lecture here, the Boulder City Council have been dealing with this issue of growth management. But as good city councilors, they were always trying to put off until tomorrow any decision on it. Because elections were coming and you really didn't want to make a commitment one way or another, because who knows, it might piss somebody off, So, you have to really be careful not to do that. So, they went on, and the citizens finally got sick of it. And they put the Residential Development Control System, known as the Danish Plan, on the ballot. And they adopted it by referendum. Don't ever do that. Ever. And if there are politicians in this audience, adopt anything before you accept a referendum. There's only one thing harder than adopting something by referendum, and that is changing something that's been adopted by referendum. Because every single change has to go back out to a vote of the people. This does not work well. Fortunately, Paul had put a 5-year sunset clause in it, so that at the end of 5 years, the mandatory nature of the referendum was over. Now, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture is the city now has adopted an implementation mechanism, but what are they implementing? And they sure don't know, because they've never done the plan. And all of a sudden, the city manager noticed that he was in quite a dilemma, that he had a citizen-mandated implementation mechanism on the books, and no plan to go after some very difficult negotiation with my wife and with others, we ended up in Boulder, and my job was to fix it. And so we went in and really, in retrospect, adopted a plan for the community. Now, that plan was no slouch. And I think in that plan are some very, very good lessons for Missoula as you move ahead. It wasn't that we felt pressure to adopt anything in order to meet the implementation mechanism. We knew that what we adopted had to last over time, longer than probably that implementation mechanism had to last. So we went back and we divided the community up into neighborhoods. And I think this is very important for you all to look at. That within your common community here, you have some really special communities. And you need to get those communities involved in government and in their own governance. And so we prepared a series of 30 neighborhood plans for each of the neighborhoods. And then on the basis of those neighborhood plans, created a comprehensive plan for the whole Boulder Valley. Now that included only about 1/3 of that was in the city proper, and 2/3 of it was in the area in general. Fortunately, politically at that point in time, the county commissioners were very scared about what had happened in the election in Boulder, and realizing that the majority of the votes they got were in Boulder, they sort of had a light bulb go on, and they said, aha, it's time to play ball. And so what we did is the county and the city adopted the plans jointly and entered into an intergovernmental agreement between them that no urban development would occur in the county unless it had been referred to the city, developed according to city standards, and developed according to a master plan for water and sewer services. So that all of a sudden, urban development got refocused back into the urban area where one could economically provide urban services. And the rural areas became holding areas for urban development to occur. One could still develop in areas outside the city, but they had to develop with the concurrence of the city, and they had to develop with the standards of the city, because the city was going to be the eventual recipient of that development. And you all can look around this valley and see all the development that's occurred in the county that's become part of the city over the years that has cost the city lots of money to take care of inadequate sewer, water, schools, all those kinds of things that go with it. So I think there are some good lessons to be learned there. The planning process of neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods weren't just neighborhoods within the city, they were neighborhoods in the county as well as the city, but within the sphere of influence. The city also defined its ultimate boundary, and it had a rational basis to it, like where does water flow? You know, basic things like that, like, you know, how far do school buses go? You all have an air attainment problem here, and it's a pretty serious one, I understand, from time to time. There are utility issues that are involved here. And you really need to start looking at what kind of development you're perpetuating here. The development that I saw today as I drove around is extremely inefficient development as services are concerned. It's very nice. It's the American dream kind of development. And it's a wonderful place to live. But keep in mind that as long as you develop that kind of development, you'll never be able to have a public transit system. The densities just aren't high enough to do that. You're not integrating commercial development into the neighborhoods. I went to South Hills, is that right? It's 15 to 20 minute drive to the nearest services. Do you think that's an efficient way? Do you think that helps the air attainment quality? Send your child to the store for a bottle of milk. He better be 18. Or else he will be 18 by the time he returns. You know, some of the basic things that go with a good neighborhood are missing. And you need to look at that in some kind of comprehensive way. The neighborhoods really need to begin to do that neighborhood planning process. You have a lot of The densification issue is real interesting. Now, let's go through Boulder a little bit. What we decided in Boulder was that we draw a ring around the outside of the city and say, anything within that ring can compete for permits. Okay, that was called the first tier development. Okay. Anything in the second tier development can apply to be part of the city. That's land that is quote unquote right for development, but not ready to be developed yet. So it can apply to attach, if you will, to the city for development. And the stuff in Ring 3 is really in reserve. And we define the ultimate city boundaries. And that's really important for you to do too, so that a lot of the communities that are around here are not afraid of the Missoula monster coming out and gobbling them up. You know, that you really honestly define some ring and say, this is it. This is where the holding capacity of this valley lies, and this is as far as the city is going to extend itself forever. And that was done in the Boulder Valley. Now, so you have Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Then what we did is we carved a hole out of the center and said, within that hole, the area where we want densification, where people can walk to work and shop and everything, within that hole, there are no regulations at all as far as development permits. So it's a real incentive. You can come in and get a building permit whenever you want, as long as it's in conformance with the zoning and certain design standards. So it's the carrot and stick thing, you know? That's the carrot. And then you have the stick in one, which says there is a system of competition that was very similar to the petaluma system initially. We then got to a point where the developer said, let us regulate ourselves. And we said, oh, welcome to the henhouse box. We said, fine, here's what we'll do. And it was called the trigger mechanism. We gave him a gun, we gave him a hair trigger. And basically said, if you can regulate yourselves and not exceed a 2% annual growth rate, we will not put into effect any of these residential development controls. And we will measure that every 6 months. And if in any one of those 6 months periods it happens, it's in effect for 2 years. For the last 7 years, we've not had to have any kind of residential development control system in effect at all, because it's been self-regulated by the development industry. What we found, and what the development industry found in a very difficult way, was that if you look at development cycles are about 8 years in length. 4 years to the overbuild and 4 years to the deficit. And I'll bet you can go back to Missoula, 1973. Was this place trucking or what? I mean, they were building houses like crazy, right? And what was it like in 1983? Dying on the vine. I mean, if you can plot this thing, you can just plot it again and again and again. What growth management, and they're very high amplitude. If you plot them, they're very high amplitude. It's overbuilt, market bottom drops out, goes down, finally absorb it. All of a sudden, there's no housing units at all. Up, overbuild, and that's called the American way. Okay? And it is. I mean, that's the free enterprise system, to be honest with you. You can see that. Well, good corporate management says what you try to do is take the amplitude out of those cycles. You don't try to take the cycles away. You just try to make the bottom and the top lower. And that's really what growth management does, is it says, here's the range in which the city can afford to operate. You can bounce around all you want within that range. And you know what? Developers actually overveer, not as a group, but overveer will tell you they love it. Because when their friends are all going bankrupt in Denver, they're still building houses. Because they're at this 2%, in Boulder, 2% growth rate. They know what the market is constantly, and the market isn't doing this on them. And that by doing that, there's always sort of a constant demand. And so the rate-to-run developers are all gone. And the long-term developers are very happy with the system and are self-regulated within it. The other thing that I think is important is to realize that there's an interrelationship between residential development and and office and industrial properties. And that you can't just regulate one side of the equation. Boulder is having a tremendous problem right now in air quality that they never had before. It used to be that there was about, and I'm going to give you some mythical numbers here, 20% of the population in Boulder commuted out of the valley every day to go to work in Denver. And 80 or 90% of the jobs within the Boulder Valley were filled by people who lived within the Boulder Valley. Today, there's about 40% of the jobs in the Boulder Valley are filled by people who live in the Boulder Valley. And there's about a 60% net in commute. So the in commute is far greater than the out commute right now within the Boulder Valley. And that's because commercial development was encouraged while residential development was discouraged. And so it even made the air quality problem worse. And that's because we were really dealing with a regional issue, but no mechanism to regulate the regional perspective. And so as you look at growth and growth management, you always have to be testing the business side as well as the residential side to make sure there's some kind of relationship between there. In the case of Missoula, you're probably fairly well isolated from that because you're not part of a larger metropolitan area and you are sort of the core of that area. So a lot of that phenomenon, the phenomenon I talked about, the bedroom community phenomenon, that one, really don't apply here. But you know, some of the anomalies do. Boulder today, as I say, has this trigger system in effect that really hasn't gone into effect for a number of years. Part of Boulder's plan, and this is, I know, dear to your heart right now, as a matter of fact, we have people recounting the ballots at the moment out here, is to buy open space lands and to really create an open space network that integrates into the city as well as surrounds the city. There were two things that we did. First of all, we adopted what we call the blue line. And we said, we will not serve water above this line. And the county agreed to that too. Well, folks, when there isn't anything in the well, where you get water determines a great deal as to where you live. Carrying buckets up the hill is not one of the things that people cherish. And so, in essence, we were really afraid that the hills were just starting to be like South Hills here. Houses are just starting to climb up over all the hills. And I got to tell you, I grew up Rattlesnake and some of these other places. It's only a matter of time before those hillsides are just devastated. And talk about, and you can start to see it. I mean, where you have a house site that's, you know, maybe 3,000 square feet, and there's 14 miles of road cut up the side of the hill. This is not exactly efficient development. And geologically, it's not real good either. In some cases, I saw some very nice slides, which I sort of chuckled at. So, you know, guys have a hard time to get up this driveway. What Boulder decided to do was to buy the hills. Today, we own 18,000 acres of open space and are buying about 1,000 acres a year. What we did, and this is of some concern, I've expressed this to several people, is that when you own open space, it's sort of like owning a boat. You know, you have to have enough money to take care of it. And it's not good enough to just buy it, but you have to manage it and maintain it, or else it burns and other things like that. So you need rangers, you need people who build trails, you need people who police it, you need people who do cattle management on it or whatever else you're going to do on the land, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you buy $8 million, now look, you have an area over here, you spent what, $500,000 on the last open space bond, $1 million something. And it's preserved a very beautiful hillside. And somehow the city absorbed, the county and the city absorbed into their budgets the maintenance of that. Now you're talking about an issue that's $8 million. And it's going to buy a lot more open space. You need to build into that a system somehow of maintaining that. And what we did is we adopted a half-cent sales tax. And I know this is a popular subject, okay? We And of that half-cent sales tax, 75% of that goes to purchasing open space and maintaining it, and 25% goes to alternate transportation. And so, for instance, all the people who work in downtown Boulder are given free bus passes. Ridership went from 0.5% to 5% ridership. Who gives those away? The parking district. Because it's cheaper to give the bus passes away than it is to build and maintain parking spaces. Okay? So, I mean, you start to do things like that, and alternate transportation, a very, very complete system. Bicycle paths, everybody said, we didn't want them. First of all, the flood control engineers are some of my favorite people. Those people, I mean, to be a flood control engineer, first of all, you have to be born backwards or something. They believe that the whole purpose of any channel is to be reserved to move the 500-year event, which hopefully will never occur. Okay? To me, as a planner, that didn't seem real efficient. And so what we decided to do was to put some bicycle paths in this floodplain. You're going to kill children. They're going to die. They're going to be consumed by the waters of God. And, and I said, well, very few kids are out riding in a rainstorm, and very few kids take their bike down into this torrent of water. It's not like it comes out of the canyon, as a wall of water. It's not like the Moses thing. It sort of comes up. And, well, they warned us and sent us all these letters that we were imperiling the citizens of the city. We built this trail system, and maybe you've seen the Boulder Creek trail system. If you haven't, you should really do see it. It's quite elegant. The problem is right now, they said nobody would ever use it. It's so stupid to waste all the money here. The problem we have right now is that we can't get all the people on it. There are people bike riding, there's people walking. The walking people are taking their walking sticks and shoving them in the spokes of bikes. And there's people who like to ride horses, and of course there's the rollerbladers who don't care about anybody and they're going in and out. And the problem we have right now is probably the most crowded spot in Boulder is on the bike path that nobody would ever use. It kills millions of people every year when the floodwaters come. We have wonderful little things, like for instance, on one bridge, everybody said, well, we can never get under that bridge. So what we did is we built a well down under, and there's a retaining wall, and there's glass along the top so that you can watch the fish swim in the river. And you know what? When it rains in the spring, you don't go under that bridge because it's full of water. And we haven't lost anybody there yet. But 99% of the rest of the time, it's a wonderful place to be. And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff. So we adopted this half-cent sales tax. And it was to be for a period of 5 years only, to begin with. 10 years, I guess it was a 10-year period. We bought lots of land. Now this half-cent sales tax, last year, it generated $7 million a year. Okay? $4 million goes to buying open space lands. $3 million goes to maintaining the 18,000 acres that we already have. Okay? There's a master plan for trail systems and a master plan for open space. And we buy in accordance with that master plan. The city is almost completely surrounded now by a couple-mile land of open space land. Now, in Boulder's case, that's going to be permanent. We extinguish the development rights on that land so that no future city council is tempted to sell it for any political reason, because the development rights are owned by the Trust for Public Lands and some other agency that we are sure will not agree to that. And so that kind of mechanism works very well. In the case of Stockholm, Sweden, they took a different tack. And in the early 1900s, Stockholm started buying open space belts around the city. Actually, in Sweden, it's a little easier because the Crown declared that that land was to be public, and it becomes public. There's no sort of fair hearing, just compensation. That's an American concept. That was the initial ring. And then now what happens in Stockholm is that ring is an open space ring, but it's also a development ring. And what the city does is has a land use plan for the development of that ring. And as competition gets to pay them for the land. They then take that money and buy 10 times that much land on the outside of the ring. And so this ring is constantly growing and moving outward. And you have to buy 10 times as much because keep in mind the way circles work in order to keep the perimeter the same as the inside. And then they reserve the lands that are necessary along creeks, parks, and all that other stuff out of that release. So that's another way that you can go about doing it. It's more communal, should I say, than we're used to sometimes here in the United States. The open space program in Boulder has been very, very successful. It's been held up as a model quite often nationally. I guess the message that I want to drive home here is, don't forget the maintenance and operation side of things when you do the purchase side of things. When you look at buying a home, you look at what your income is, and you know the formula that the banker uses as to how much he's going to lend you has built into it your ability to maintain the property, because that's his investment that you're living in as well as yours. And so the same is true when you're buying open space lands or public lands. Be sure you have a mechanism in place to take care of it. And the only way that I know that you can do that, unless you're real good at taking special issues out on an annual basis to the citizens, is to find some source that is an ongoing source of revenue to do that with. And then that expresses a community value. One of the observations that I made as I drove through town, I said, nice town, beautiful flying land. And we're driving along, and I go, there's a shop front. There's a Target. Oh, there's a new Walmart. And all of a sudden, I realized that there's enough big box users in this town to take care of 200,000 people. And I'm going, what is this? Well, the fact is, it is taking care of 200,000 people. It's taking care of your market trade area. Now, as a community, you need to be benefiting from that. They're using your services and not paying their fair share. You know, sales tax is a very strange little thing. And that is, if you look at the sales, you're 44, and the total market's 200. Isn't it nice if those sales could be paid for your open space? That's the way sales tax works. You're already the sales center. Why not work on it? I know there's state legislation and all this other stuff involved, but maybe that should be one of your top priorities. You need to look at a very long-term source for buying open space, for preserving these mountains and hillsides that makes this such a magnificent place to live. LA, move to LA. You know, that isn't why you moved here. And you know, this place will look in 15, 20 years like LA if you keep developing the way you're developing right now. And so you need to understand that there's personal property rights involved in this. There's just compensation that's involved in this. And if it's a community value that you act and look a certain way, then you got to pay for it. It's that simple. And you have to figure out a way that's an equitable way to pay for it. That the people who benefit from it are the people who pay. And so I don't know what that magic is, whether it's all-out assault on Helena, whether it's a Trojan horse, you know, who knows, that you need to take down there. I don't know what it is, whether it's a self-imposed property tax that's dedicated strictly to that source. And a master plan. And again, I point out the real necessity to have a master plan for trails, systems, master plan for open space acquisition. It's okay to say what land you're going to buy. It really is. It's okay to say. That's going to be open space. It's a real honest thing to do. And what I've found over the 23 years I've been in this business is that real honest things are the ones that are defensible in court. You know, the first question you always have to ask yourself as a mayor or as a council is it fair? And if you can answer that properly, then you deal with the details. And that's the hardest question to answer when you're they have enough reserve now that they can say, yeah, we'll buy it. And we'll take that 2,000 acres or whatever it is and put it into open space. And some of the land they buy and only use a portion of it and release the other portion for development because on the plan it shows that it's a developed parcel. The other thing that you have the ability to do is to do transfer of development rights. For instance, if you want the hills to be free of development, those hills, what is it, 1 acre, 5 acre lots, whatever it is, 1 acre lots, let's say, okay, that you need in order to build up there, you can calculate how many dwelling hillside. And what you can say is, look, what we want is a denser core in open mountains. And so right now in the core, you're only allowed to develop 5 units to the acre. Tell you what, we're going to raise that to 20 units to the acre, but the 15 units to the acre additional have to be bought from a transfer development right from the hills. And so what you do is you set up a development right bank, in essence, where people in the hills sell their development right to their acre lot. Development bank buys it, sells it to people who want to do more dense development in the core. That kind of what are called TDRs, transfer development rights, have been used in many different communities throughout the United States. It first started with historic preservation. You know, in New York City, you see some of these little buildings, you know, next to these very big buildings, and you go, man, I wonder who's holding on to that land. Well, the fact is that all the air rights have been sold off to those big buildings next to it, and nobody can ever develop there. So they sell air rights. They don't even sell land. They sell air. That's New York City. So those are the kind of things that you know that are possible. Now, what I'm going to do is shut up because I've talked too long here and answer questions or any kinds of thoughts that you have or observations for me to think about as we work in the next couple of days in small committees. Hello, wake up.
Well, the one thing that you haven't dealt with is sort of controlling the absolute number, it seems like. I mean, I've been in Boulder, and it's a very nice town, but it seems awfully crowded. I mean, is there anything you can do? I mean, and if Boulder's growing at 2% a year, it's going to double in, what, 30 years?
Right.
I mean,
But there is an holding capacity. No. Yeah, you can do a holding capacity study and say, look, unless personalized vehicles change the propulsion system, and unless X, Y, and Z happen, then the maximum number of people we can cram on this face of the earth with our own standards that we have today is X. Okay? And Boulder's done that. The holding capacity of the valley is 130,000 people. Period.
how many people live there now?
In the valley itself, about 80. Now, there are some people who argue the holding capacity value is 75,000 and we're looking for 5 and we're back, you know. Until you put sterling in the water supply, that's probably not a valid assumption to make. There has to be some kind of growth potential there. That really leads to sort of the regional planning issue too, and the balance of industry and work and jobs and people, you know. The university is a tremendous generator of jobs in Boulder. Not only the university itself, but then you have the National Bureau of Standards, you have NOAA, you have NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research, you have, I can go on and on, but there's maybe 15 federal agencies that are there that are all research directed to the university. Plus, then there's maybe 50 to 100 companies, the AT&T research centers there, Supergin, Somatogen, all the gins that come out of the genetic engineering side of the university are all there. Unless you're saying, look, there's also a maximum holding capacity to commercial development and industry, and that is in some kind of balance with the residential stuff, all you're going to do is throw the residential development on the outskirts and cause a greater inconvenience. And so what you have to do is say, look, if in fact the holding capacity of the valley is met, then we need to help people move to Helen or to Billings or somewhere else where they can accommodate growth. And that's a pretty tall order to do that because people are basically greedy. And they want all the good stuff. They want all the revenue and none of the costs. I mean, if you look at residential development, it costs you money. I'm looking at it as a municipal manager now, okay? Every residential unit out there is a negative cash flow to me. Every business, and industry is a positive cash flow to me. Now, what do I want? Well, if I'm lunatic, I want residential stuff. If I'm looking for a profit or to fund things, then I'm looking for the commercial development. If you're really rational, then what you're looking for is a balance between the two. I mean, if you're going to have a good, healthy corporation, then what you want to do is balance the two together. And that's really the comprehensive planning process to do that. And you have to do that on a valley-wide basis. So it has to be done cooperatively with the county and implement cooperatively with the county.
What are some of the mechanisms for keeping the community or town, whatever, within energy security?
Transportation. Limiting transportation improvements. Transportation improvements that are overbuilt with extra capacity in them only are an attraction to further development. So if you have a good comprehensive plan for the valley, you know that XYZ Street in its ultimate capacity will carry 20,000 vehicles a day and only needs to be 2 lanes wide. You know Z Street is going to carry 150,000 vehicles a day and has to be 6 lanes wide. Okay? So that you build the street capacity to the ultimate capacity plan of the valley. That's number one. Number two is you size the water systems and sewer systems. Now, I understand the water system is a privately owned system, but let me tell you, what goes in comes out. And you can size the sewer system to the size, to the right capacity. Now, there's some weird things that can happen. I'll give you a little example. This is sort of a fun thing. You know, we adopted gambling in Colorado in the historic cities of Central City and some of these other things to help improve the quality, the historic quality of the city. Well, in fact, it's completely destroyed. But the funny thing is that they also put in the sewer plants to the capacity, to the ultimate capacity of the city. The problem is they're 3 years old, they've torn them all out. And the problem is that alcohol kills the bacteria that makes sewer plants work. And so they have to go to tertiary treatment, no bug system there. So you find little quirks once in a while in the system that you design. So the utility systems are really the key. And then zoning areas, and then open space acquisition. And, you know, in sort of that order or level of magnitude. The other thing is, I don't know how the planning for the schools and the city's planning take place, but I couldn't find any rational relationship between where the schools were located and where the development was. Now, maybe I was missing something, but the one site we went by that somebody said, well, they reserved that for a school site, had 11 houses on it. The school district sold it off and developed houses on it. So I'm not sure that there's a rational relationship. The other thing is, I think we need to look at impact fees that deal with the impact of new development. Remember that curve I told you about? There's 2 parts to that with the school systems, how they lag behind. If you have exponential growth, the schools get further and further behind. There's 2 parts to the school system. One is manning it, and the other is building it. And the capital infrastructure costs are the ones that are hard to come up with. Because the operation costs aren't as difficult because there is a per capita student allotment. You basically can run the schools hopefully on that number. So one of the things that you need to look at is some kind of fee structure that allows the capital infrastructure of the schools to get built as development occurs.
He's talking about only capacity in the valley. Boulder has very concentrated city and green space and
Right.
more rural area. How do you calculate that one could say, why shouldn't that all be dense urban area rather than that mixture?
Right.
Or put the question more broadly, in terms of the variables for holding capacity, it seems to me that the social dimension has to have an important.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the basis.
Right.
Social dimension is the basis.
How do you-
It's community values. It's a community value process that you go through. I mean, there are some communities that say, LA looks great. I mean, lots of people live there. You know? Willingly. I often wondered if fences in LA keep people in or out. You know? But there are a certain set of community values that are going to be very different. That's why I say very different in every community. Right? And if one of your values, but then also communities have conflicting values, and they don't always recognize them as that. For instance, they say, what we want is we want an efficient public transit system. We want people to get out of their car, and we want 1 acre lots. That's a divergent value system. And so you need to be able to work through, or have somebody work through with you, where those sort of conflicts in your values are, and be able to resolve them one way or the other, and say, well, you know, buses are just something we think is neat, but probably would never ride one myself. Then you need to lay that aside and say, okay, what we really want are 1 acre lots. Well, how many 1 acre lots can you get in the valley? It's a pretty inefficient land use pattern, and so you're not going to get very many because of the commute miles, the vehicle trip miles that are involved in that.
The problem when you introduce the social values is there are people who want to rely only on what's scientifically provable, and you can't measure those kinds of things.
If you have those kind of people, suggest they move to LA. They can measure anything they want out there. No, they really are. They're quality of life standards. And every community has a different quality of life. And not only that, but the quality of life your parents have in this community are quite different than the quality of life standards that you have. So it's an ongoing process, and that's why this feedback loop that I talked about is so critical in any planning process. That it's a constant testing. And that it's not a process that's static in time.
Well, I appreciate what you said about the differences in communities. In particular, the difference between a small city like Missoula, which is a regional center itself, and yet it's a small city, and either Petaluma or
Right, which are part of a metropolitan area.
which are an urban area. I think that Missoula is in the phase, reminds me very much of the phase in Boulder's existence when I lived there, which was prior to 1970. And prior to Danish, prior to any intent growth management.
That was probably the wheels of the spoke.
The spokes of the wheel. But that is an important thing.
Right.
That is, and that's something that Missoula needs. Some mechanism which is going to enable the city to annex ahead of the valley.
Right.
Whereas in Missoula, we have the problem, as Dan Kemmis is painfully aware, that about 40% of the city, something like that, is not within the city. The is outside the city. And that's a chronic situation. 20 years ago, indeed, it was about the same.
Right.
But, however, there are some things that we have going for us here, and you touched on several of them. One, Boulder never succeeded in exporting the Greenbelt concept beyond the city. There was a county system, but it was rather small and efficient, and even today, it's the city that does it. And of course, when satellite towns of Rupert and Lafayette decided to grow, they decided to go the other way.
Right, but the county now has a very, very large and aggressive open space program. And it rivals both cities.
But you do have Louisville
Right.
and all those.
And they're going to the county, and they're using the county open space system to buy open space around their communities. What happens is that as long as the land is sort of raw land, well, the people that own the raw land don't see any wisdom in open space because some of it might come off of their land.
Yeah,
But the minute you get enough people living there to go, I can't walk out my front door without tripping Then what's happened, for instance, in Broomfield 10 years ago was people who were looking for development opportunities to occur on their land. Today, there are people who are looking for some open space because they're living on that land. And so the politics have really shifted fairly radically in the 10-year period in Broomfield.
Well, the point I wanted to make by comparison is that we're in the phase that Boulder was in when it started its Greenbelt program, prior to the and we were trying to do this not just for the city, but for the entire county, meaning incorporating all of the satellite communities. And I hope it will go into the Rebellion County, which is also satellite to Missoula.
Right.
And so we may be able to do that on a regional basis, much simpler than
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that I think you have a real advantage here is that you have a very close working relationship between the city and the county planning department being one and the same.
It's not
there are some problems. I know. Just thought I'd add some levity here. You know, to me, the ideal situation would be that a group of concerned citizens like yourself become very actively involved with the county commissioners and with the city council and with the outlying communities, and that there is a plan adopted for the county as a whole, and an intergovernmental agreement is signed by every one of those communities as to the implementation of that plan. So that it's a joint signature between the city of Missoula, the county, the surrounding neighbor communities that are not incorporated, but the communities around, all become signatories to that plan. And that any modifications to that plan require the signatures to approve. So that it really does become a regional plan, but nobody has to give up their sovereignty in order to implement it. To me, if I were a county commissioner, that would make me very happy to see something like that in place, because 90% of what I'm probably dealing with are called warring factions. And that would, to a great degree, remove that. And that I'd have a shield to hide behind, in essence, when they come at me and say, oh, this is a jointly adopted plan, I really can't unilaterally override it. So to me, if there's one thing that you could do, and it seems to be totally doable within the state law and not unsurmountable, is to have that kind of overall development plan, develop ultimate spheres of influence or boundaries, and to get some kind of joint intergovernmental agreement that agrees that people would play with that game plan. And then develop a process for updating it. Don't assume that it's static forever.
May I make just one other very quick comment about another contrast, and this is something else you mentioned. You urged us to find some kind of ongoing mechanism for acquisition and also for maintenance. And the proposal that was made last spring for this bond issue was that there would be, in addition, created a park district which would have an ongoing millage for doing that. And the coalition that was formed here included both open space advocates, the traditional open space of Boulder, and park and recreation people, so that we already have, I think, the mechanism to integrate acquisition and maintenance. Something Boulder never got, because its open space program is still towards
completely different parts, exactly.
Something that I never understood.
Well, there's lots of things involved. I don't understand. I just experienced.
It was a take it yesterday.
Uncle Ted, yes, it was.
We're currently engaging in a growth management planning process here in Missoula County between the city and the county.
Yeah, I think that's really encouraging.
Yeah, and could you reflect on how that process, how the process was formulated, how it was entered into to arrive at a growth management plan in the areas that you have experienced?
Well, let me, the two examples I gave you, one was sort of about a crisis in Petaluma where, things were just happening so fast that people couldn't deal with it anymore. And that really, for that there hasn't been a sort of cataclysmic event that's occurred yet. And maybe you have to let a small cataclysmic event happen of some kind. But that was one. In the case of Boulder, it was really ex post facto planning. It was like, hold on, we got this implementation mechanism. Now what do we do? You have the opportunity here to do it right, which is really what you're doing. First of all, to get that task force going. That task force needs to look at itself as a core, though, and not as the ultimate group. And you really need to get broad-based community involvement in that process. And that's why I suggested early on the neighborhood planning process, or developing segment plans or something that deal with that, really are critical, because when you go to a vote, it's going to cost somebody some money. And you better have a real broad-based support base out there, because, you know, it's real great for all of us to sit here in this room and talk about that, and the reason you're here is you're really interested in it. But I can tell you, you don't swing the election here. This isn't a majority. And so it's really, really important to have that broad-based support and understanding. What I've found over the years, again, sort of 23 years as a planning director, 98% of the problems I deal with are problems of misunderstanding, of people who immediately jump to a conclusion without listening to what the facts are. And only about 2% of them are based on some kind of factual disagreement. And what happens is if people get entrenched in their ways, it doesn't matter what the facts are, they aren't facts to them. And so I think the process that you're starting on is a very good process, but you really need to make that outreach immediately and really deal with, I mean, there doesn't have to be, a jointly adopted intergovernmental agreement plan is probably as powerful a growth management tool as any kind of regulatory system that would be implemented, as long as there is an intergovernmental agreement that requires people to abide by it. You know, so again, if you look at what's possible in the political climate here and what's possible in the regulatory climate, keep in mind that you're not going to make a quantum leap into the future. You're going to do it a couple steps at a time. And you need to just sort of chart a course that you're going to take to get it done. But the key to me is really getting the grassroots level support for this. People who live up Rattlesnake Canyon like to ride their horses. Maybe you talk about a horse trail system on open space then. And that's what they would be about. But you go out and hold these neighborhood meetings with the defined neighborhoods and say, what are your stakes in this? And what can you do to help see that it occurs? That's about all. But I think you're going at it the right way. My fear is, in any community, and you have all the elements for this to happen here, and the last election was sort of the start of that occurring maybe, is that if evolution is not occurring, revolution will. And one of the revolutionary tactics is to put something in a referendum form and on the ballot, and it sends the message loud and clear. Just don't send it too long. This is what I'm saying, is that unless you have that feedback loop built into the system, you've just created a system that you can almost assure will kill you.
Just a quick question. Say, for instance, in Boulder, Petaluma, who took the lead in regards to just for lack of a better word, ramrodding the process and making sure that broad public involvement was instituted? And
one fiery idiot, one fiery person, Paul Danish. Paul, if you've ever met Paul, he's about this tall and just a pistol, just absolutely crazy man. And he went out and really organized Plan Boulder and all these sort of conservation and groups that exist in the area, and really sort of, and the fact that the citizens were getting tired of being inundated
exactly a hired gun or somebody with a big name. He was somebody that really owned the process.
Right, right. It doesn't take a big name. I mean, it really doesn't. It's going to be a couple really concerned citizens who say, for the next 2 years, I dedicate myself to having this happen. And I think your growth management task force is a real good root group to focus things on, but they need to be the focal point and not the generation point of the heat.
You've already got a problem with people offering land at a higher value. I guess the real question is, how do they set the value on open space land?
Sure. The answer is yes, they have. Two things occur. Number one, the city has the right to condemn property. Use it very, 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 very rarely, but every city has that right. This city has that right, and probably uses it very, very, very rarely. Sometimes rattling the sword is enough to convince somebody that the sword's in the saber. Number one. Number two is if you offer a fair price, what we do is this in Boulder. We go out and get an appraisal of the property for the use it's being used for right now. We offer to pay for an appraisal from the property owner to go out and get their own appraisal. If the appraisals are radically different, we offer to pay for and hire a third appraiser, a review appraiser, to review the two appraisals and come up with a third appraisal. And we offer that price. If the people aren't willing to sell, we basically walk away from the deal. They can't develop their land. The county won't issue a building permit because they're in an open space designated area. They can build a single house on the property, or one on every 40 acres, in your case, one on every 160 acres. But that's it. To be honest with you, we've really only never gotten to that point. We just wait until they're ready to sell. And now we're to the point where we're not even going out and looking for land. There's more land being offered to the city than the city has money to buy.
Just before you take another question, Frank, we're going to work pretty hard for the next day, so we probably ought to let him go here in a few minutes. So you should take however many more questions you want. And then before everybody leaves, we'd like to have Anne Mary Lisa just sum things up a little bit here. So you go ahead and
great.
it up, and then we'll have Anne Mary.
5, 10 more. Yeah.
You mentioned the decreasing air quality that goes along with development, and the fact that building more transportation systems as you go with more traffic.
Right.
Air quality increases along with it. Now, clearly air quality is becoming more important given the social sports studies that many people are aware of, linking acceptable quality air to health.
Right.
If you are trying to limit the kind of traffic that we're seeing in Missoula, what inducement do you have that really works, perhaps in Boulder, to get people out of their cars and on bicycles and on foot?
Our goal, I mean, this is sound. Our goal is to get 10% of the trips done by alternate transportation. And that's pretty high. If you can get 5%, it's considered a miracle. So this is something beyond a miracle. This is sort of like immaculate conception. The way you do it is you provide facilities for it to occur. There's no way you can force it to occur. We've done all kinds of crazy stuff in Boulder. We've built bike paths all over the place. You can go anywhere in Boulder now and bike paths. They're separated, they go under major roadways. Like I said, we spend 1/4 of the transportation budget every year has to be spent on alternate transportation. No matter how large the transportation budget gets, 1/4 of it has to be spent on alternate transportation. You provide things like, for instance, one of the reasons why people would not ride the bus, I'm here, bus system, here you don't. One of the reasons why people wouldn't ride the bus was they were afraid that if they had an emergency at home or their child got sick, they couldn't get home. In our bus pass program, you're entitled to take a taxi cab in case of an emergency and it's picked up at the bus pass. If you abuse it, you lose it. I mean, if there's 20 taxi cab rides in a month, somebody's going to come up to you. But basically, you need to know that if you're going to make a commitment to take public transportation, then if there is an emergency, that you have a way to get immediately to your place. You do things like flexible transit. For instance, we have transit for the elderly that is done on a call-ahead scheduled basis, which are done with a series of vans. You make the vehicle appropriate to the community or neighborhood. I can remember when I moved to Boulder, there was a 370 passenger bus, it seemed like, sort of like a 747, that came down our street every day. Sort of, we'd sit on the porch and the bus would go by, and there was nobody on it, And the question is this an appropriate vehicle for the neighborhood? No, it wasn't. Today there's little 19 passengers, little Mercedes diesel buses that run down the street. Actually, they're natural gas powered vehicles that run down the street that are appropriate for the size of the. So you gear the vehicles for the population that you're trying to serve. You look at alternative fuels for that. You work with employers to do van pulling, that kind of thing. There's a whole series of things, and what probably, again, one of the best offices, there's a whole office called the Office of Alternate Transportation in Boulder. All they do is deal with alternate transportation programs. It's a very good study. I'm sure it's not the only one in the United States, or even the best one, but it is one I know about. And they deal with all these kinds of issues on a daily basis, mainly working with major employers. Also then providing more dense housing opportunities closer to work, living relationship type things. That helps a lot because alternate transportation doesn't work if you live in South Hills here and work out of LP. It doesn't work. There isn't anybody that's going to ride that on a bike unless they're a bike freak.
Would it be accurate to say that a person living in Boulder who makes $40,000 a year would not qualify to buy any house in Boulder?
No, not at all. There are a whole series of programs the city has taken on the issue of affordable housing. There are a whole series of both publicly subsidized housing, but there's also, if you look at the issue of housing and affordability, it has to do with income of the person. The worst combination in the world you can do is cheap housing for low-income people. That's known as a slum. I mean, that is absolutely the worst. So it's not the cost of the house, it's the income of the person that you're dealing with. And so there are income supplement programs that occur also. There are requirements to provide low and moderate income housing as part of a development. For instance, let's look at a cul-de-sac development, just a typical subdivision where you have quarter-acre lots, and then you get to the end of the cul-de-sac, there are displays. But what they do is they allow you to put smaller units on smaller lots in displayed areas so that you can actually get some $80,000 houses in a subdivision where most of the houses are $150,000. Now, is the housing in Boulder a lot more expensive than the housing in Missoula? Absolutely. And it always will be, because it's part of a metropolitan area, and you're not. Housing prices in Boulder, this is real interesting, because we've plotted housing in Boulder over the last 100 years. They've been 20% higher than housing in Denver, almost consistently, for the last 100 years. And there's very little fluctuation in that. And I got to tell you, the living environment is 20% better. And so the answer is that growth management has had very little effect. They're still about 20% higher than housing in Denver. And as the housing market regionally increases in value, yes, the housing prices go up. We looked at some houses up here today when we drove around. Somebody said, well, they're probably $150,000 houses. In Boulder, they're probably $450,000 houses. I mean, that's the cost differential. But in Denver, they're probably $250,000 houses. So it's a relative thing. The answer is yes, there is a social responsibility to make sure that there's a broad range of affordability of housing. One of the real dilemmas that you have in doing neighborhood fix-up cleanup programs, for instance, if you start fixing up the area around the mills out here, really doing community improvement and everything, all of a sudden the people that live there can't afford to live there anymore. You know, and so it's the trickle-down theory of housing. And so where do they trickle down? They trickle down actually out into the county area, which means that when you look at housing issues, you have to look at them regionally and not locally. You know, city boundaries are not logical boundaries. They're political boundaries, and there's nothing logical about all. No, listen. Wasn't that Teddy? No, that was so that you can't just stop at a city limit line and say, this is, you know, we have to have balanced housing within these confines. It doesn't work that way. And so what you have to make sure is that within the regional perspective, that there's housing opportunity. Go ahead, and then we'll go back here.
The question then, are you suggesting that the real way to deal with housing, most fundamentally, is through the economy?
Is jobs, and also the income supplement to people. You know, it's a lot of people attack housing by trying to build cheap housing, and by and large, it doesn't work. And I don't know if you remember the Boise Cascade houses of the 70s. They were known as instant slums, the 235, 236 programs. I mean, the day you moved in, they started falling apart. Is that lumber coming here? Okay.
Just a question about the density dilemma, which you have alluded to a number of times. I think that's a real issue here in our area as an inner city dweller, for example, myself. We want open space in our neighborhoods, not people packed one on another in high density housing.
Right.
A lot of multiple units, a lot of rooming houses. You've alluded to this by saying we need all this transportation, more density packed in close to jobs. And how do you solve this dilemma?
It's a real difficult problem, and we deal with it because we're a university town in Boulder. I mean, and I'm sure you have some of that same problem. One of the problems that we have just sociologically is that we've tended to, over the years, overzone neighborhoods. So if you look at your neighborhood, maybe it's zoned for 8 X's, but all that's developed there are single-family homes. And somebody someday goes, yeah, I think I'll build an 8-plex, and the neighborhood goes berserk. And what really happens is that you don't, what we found over the years is that the only way to deal with that issue is really do neighborhood-level planning. And that is where the neighborhoods sit down and say, you know, this area over here, yeah, you probably could get some more density in there. But over here, we want single-family homes, and we're willing to rezone ourselves to single-family zoning. And that's the real dilemma, is that people want both worlds. They want to be able to sell their property as a multifamily property, but they want to live in it as a single-family house. That dog don't hunt. You know, you gotta choose one way or the other. You gotta figure out whether you want to be multifamily or single family. And the key to it though, the real key, the real basis point is that you have to do the planning at the neighborhood level. It has to be grounded up